Welcome to DCF Investigations. The Pacific Northwest is a landscape of dualities. It is a place of breathtaking, verdant beauty, where the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks create a cathedral of silence that has stood for centuries. But it is also a place of profound isolation. The dense canopy that filters the sunlight into a kaleidoscope of greens also casts long, impenetrable shadows. In the state of Oregon, the wilderness is not just a backdrop. It is a character in the story, a keeper of secrets, a silent witness to things that were never meant to be hidden, and yet were never meant to be found. To understand the mystery we are delving into today, you must first understand the atmosphere of Oregon in 1986. It was a time when the logging industry, once the beating heart of the state's economy, was beginning to falter, leaving behind a web of overgrown service roads and abandoned tracks that cut through the mountains like scars. These roads, often deep in the Tualatin Mountains and the ranges bordering the Willamette Valley, became places where the laws of civilization felt distant. They were the domain of timber cruisers, hunters, and those looking to disappear. It was in this setting, on a damp, overcast morning in May of 1986, that the silence of the woods was broken, not by the roar of a chainsaw, but by a discovery that would haunt investigators for nearly 40 years. We are taking you back to May 10, 1986. The location is a remote stretch of forest off Rocky Point Road, a rugged area in the Tualatin Mountains. While this specific case is technically cataloged within Multnomah County, its legacy and the investigative efforts surrounding it have reverberated through every law enforcement agency in Oregon, including the neighboring Lane County, as detectives from across the state have tried to piece together the identity of a man who seemed to have walked out of time itself. On that Saturday morning, a group of loggers was working in a section of second-growth timber. The area had been logged decades prior, in the 1940s, and had since been reclaimed by the brush. As they moved through the undergrowth, navigating the steep terrain, one of the men stumbled upon something that didn't belong. Half buried in the detritus of the forest floor, the pine needles, the decaying leaves, and the damp earth, was a human skull. The loggers immediately halted their work. The air in the woods, already heavy with moisture, seemed to thicken. They contacted the authorities, and soon, the quiet logging road was swarming with deputies and forensic personnel. As investigators carefully brushed away the layers of earth, the full picture of the scene began to emerge, and it was baffling. The remains were almost entirely skeletonized, suggesting the body had been there for a significant amount of time. The medical examiner would later estimate that the man had been dead for anywhere from 6 months to perhaps a year. Though the damp Oregon climate accelerates decomposition, making precision difficult. But it wasn't just the bones that intrigued the detectives. It was what was found with them. Lying near the remains was a rusted .38 caliber revolver. It was an older model, the metal pitted and corroded by the elements. Inside the cylinder, investigators found live rounds, save for one spent casing. This detail immediately suggested a narrative. A man walks into the woods, sits down beneath the trees, and ends his own life. It is a tragic but not uncommon story in the lonely expanses of the Pacific Northwest. However, as the crime scene technicians processed the site, the simple suicide theory began to fray at the edges. First, there was the condition of the skeleton. The man was missing his hands and feet. While animal scavenging is a common occurrence in the wild, coyotes and bears often scatter smaller bones. The absence of these specific parts, combined with the degradation of the clothing, raised questions. Was this purely the work of nature, or had someone tried to hinder identification? The man's personal effects offered tantalizing, yet frustratingly vague, clues. He was wearing a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, the kind that suggested a certain age and perhaps a conservative style. He wore police-style low-quarter shoes, a detail that would later spark one of the most fascinating theories in Oregon's cold case history. He also had a distinct watch, and in his pockets, a few coins. Currency that dated back years, but nothing that definitively pinned him to 1986. There was no wallet, no driver's license, no suicide note. Just a pile of bones, a gun, and a mystery that was about to go cold for decades. For the next several years, the 1986 John Doe sat in a box in the medical examiner's office. In the late 80s and early 90s, DNA technology was in its infancy. Forensic anthropology relied heavily on dental records and physical descriptions. The description of our John Doe was broad. A white male, likely over the age of 50, perhaps even into his 60s or 70s. He stood somewhere between 5'7" and 5'9". He likely suffered from arthritis or other age-related ailments. The case was entered into the national databases, but without a name, without a fingerprint, and without a dental match, the file gathered dust. He became just another number, another unidentified in a state with vast wildernesses that swallow secrets whole. But the story does not end in the 1980s. In fact, the true investigation, the deep dive that would captivate the entire region, was only just beginning. As we moved into the 2000s, the field of forensics underwent a revolution. Dr. Nisi Vance, a renowned forensic anthropologist with the Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office, began a crusade to clear the backlog of unidentified persons in the state. She recognized that the boxes on the shelves weren't just evidence. They were people. They were fathers, brothers, and sons who had vanished. In 2004, the file of the 1986 John Doe was reopened. Dr. Vance and her team knew that modern science could see things that the investigators of 1986 could not. They re-examined the bones. They looked at the gun again. And most importantly, they began the process of extracting DNA. This was not an easy task. The bones had been exposed to the wet, acidic soil of the Oregon mountains for months before discovery, and then stored for decades. Genetic material degrades. But through persistence, a sample was eventually sent to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. And this is where the case takes a turn into the bizarre. As investigators looked at the profile of the man, an older gentleman, wire-rimmed glasses, police-style shoes, found with a gun, a theory began to circulate in the cold case community. It was a theory that, if true, would solve not just the 1986 case, but one of the oldest mysteries in American history. Detectives began to wonder, was the man found in the woods in 1986 actually Marvin Alvin Clark? To understand the weight of this possibility, we have to step back even further. To Halloween weekend, 1926. Marvin Clark was a town marshal from Tigard, Oregon. On October 30, 1926, the 75-year-old Clark left his home to visit his daughter in Portland. He boarded a stagecoach, yes, a stagecoach, and was never seen again. He held the distinction of being one of the oldest active missing persons cases in the United States. The parallels were striking. Marvin Clark walked with a limp. The John Doe had arthritis. Marvin Clark was an older man. Marvin Clark was a former lawman, hence the police-style shoes found on the skeleton in 1986. The location in the Tualatin Mountains was along the route Clark might have traveled or become lost in. Could it be possible? Could a man who vanished in 1926 have survived in the wilderness or lived a secret life for 60 years, only to die in 1986? Or more plausibly, had the medical examiner in 1986 been wrong about the time of death? Could the skeleton have been lying there, hidden by the deep brush, not for 6 months, but for 60 years? The wire-rimmed glasses found on the John Doe were of a style popular in the 1920s. The revolver found with him was an older model. The coin pocket contained change, but the dates were corroded. The theory was seductive. It connected two impossible mysteries into one logical solution. For years, this theory was the primary focus. Internet sleuths, journalists, and even law enforcement officials scrutinized the connection. If the 1986 Doe was Marvin Clark, it would be a forensic miracle. But true crime is rarely so poetic. Dr. Vance and her team needed definitive proof. They needed to compare the DNA from the 1986 bones with the descendants of Marvin Clark. This required a massive genealogical undertaking. They had to trace Clark's family tree forward from 1926, find living relatives, and convince them to provide DNA samples. It took years. Finally, in the late 2010s, the results came back. The DNA was not a match. The 1986 John Doe was not Marvin Clark. The revelation was a crushing blow to the investigation. It meant that Marvin Clark was still missing, and the man in the woods was back to being a ghost without a name. The police-style shoes were just shoes. The wire-rimmed glasses were just a style choice of an older man in the 80s. The revolver was just a gun. So, who is he? We are left with a profile that is both specific and maddeningly generic. We know he was a white male. We know he was likely between 5'7" and 5'9". We know he was older, likely born in the early 20th century. He had dental work, but it hasn't matched any records. Let's look at the alternative theories that have emerged since the Marvin Clark lead collapsed. Theory number 1. The despondent traveler. The location off Rocky Point Road is not easy to get to by accident, but it is accessible if you're looking for isolation. The presence of the gun and the single spent casing strongly supports the suicide theory. Is it possible this man was someone who had no close family, a drifter, or perhaps someone who had outlived his contemporaries? In 1986, it was easier to slip through the cracks. If he traveled to Oregon from out of state, parked a car that was towed and never connected to the body, or hitchhiked to the trailhead, he could have walked into the woods to end his pain on his own terms. Theory number 2. The misidentified homicide. While the scene looked like a suicide, the missing hands and feet remain a point of contention for some. Could the scene have been staged? If the gun was planted and the body moved, the lack of identification could be intentional. However, forensic pathologists generally agree that the pattern of bone scattering is consistent with animal predation. The homicide theory largely rests on the lack of ID. Why would a man commit suicide without leaving a note or identification unless he wanted to remain anonymous? Or perhaps he simply didn't care. Theory number 3. The Lane County connection. There has been speculation about missing persons from neighboring Lane County. In the 1980s, the I-5 corridor and the highways leading into the Cascades were hunting grounds for serial offenders and dumping grounds for victims. While the gun suggests suicide, we must consider the possibility that the weapon belonged to a killer, left behind to confuse the scene. But ballistics and the position of the body make this less likely. Today, the investigation into the 1986 John Doe has entered a new phase: Investigative Genetic Genealogy. This is the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer. The Oregon State Medical Examiner's Office, in partnership with private labs, is currently working to build a family tree for this man. They're taking the DNA profile, the same one that ruled out Marvin Clark, and uploading it to databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA. They are looking for second cousins, third cousins, anyone who shares a segment of genetic code with our Doe. It is a painstaking process. It involves building reverse family trees, combing through census records from the 1930s and 40s, and cold calling potential relatives. Did you have an uncle who went west and never came back? Did your grandfather have a brother who disappeared in the 80s? As of this moment, the 1986 John Doe remains unidentified. He is still waiting in the evidence room. His glasses, his watch, and that rusted revolver are waiting with him. The tragedy of this case is not just the death, but the erasure of a life. This man lived for 50, maybe 60 years. He had a childhood. He likely had a job, perhaps a family, certainly friends. He lived through wars, through cultural shifts, through the entirety of the mid-20th century. And yet, he died alone in the Oregon woods. And for 40 years, no one has come forward to claim him. There is someone out there, perhaps watching this right now, who holds the missing piece of the puzzle. Maybe you remember a neighbor who vanished in 1986. Maybe you have a family story about a great uncle who moved to Oregon and stopped writing letters. The science is catching up. The DNA is being analyzed. But science needs a starting point. It needs a name. This case serves as a grim reminder of how easily a person can slip away from the tether of society. The woods of the Pacific Northwest are vast, and they are indifferent to our need for closure. But we are not indifferent. We at DCF Investigations will continue to monitor the Oregon State Medical Examiner's progress. We believe that every John Doe has a name, and every pile of bones deserves a headstone. If you have any information regarding a missing older male from the mid-1980s, particularly one who wore wire-rimmed glasses and may have had a background in law enforcement or security, please contact the Oregon State Police or the Multnomah County Medical Examiner's Office. Until then, he remains the man in the woods. The man who wasn't Marvin Clark. The man who walked into the trees and never walked out. What do you think happened on that ridge in 1986? Was it a quiet end to a long life? Or is there a darker story hidden in the undergrowth? Let us know your theories in the comments below. This is DCF Investigations. We don't just tell the story, we chase the truth. Stay safe and stay observant.